Nicholas Hargrove, known simply as Nick to most, was born into a family that valued tradition, loyalty, and respect. His father, Paul Hargrove, was a former military officer who became a respected businessman, owning a chain of automotive repair shops. His mother, Amelia Hargrove, was a kind but strict woman who dedicated her life to her family, instilling in Nick a sense of duty and responsibility from a very young age. Growing up in a small town in Massachusetts, Nick was the golden boy, charming, athletic, and smart, with a heart as big as his ambitions. Nick had always been someone who put others before himself. He was the type of person people could rely on, whether it was his friends, his family, or even strangers in need. From an early age, he learned that trust was something earned, and once broken, it could never truly be repaired. His father, a stern man who had lived through the unforgiving experiences of war, often lectured Nick on the importance of honor. His mother, a pillar of patience, reinforced those teachings with love and compassion. For Nick, these principles became the foundation of who he was. In high school, Nick excelled both academically and athletically. He was a star on the football field, leading his team to multiple championships, and his natural leadership abilities made him a role model for his peers. But despite the attention and accolades, Nick was humble. He never let success go to his head, always making time for his family and ensuring that his younger brother, David, stayed on the right path. After graduating at the top of his class, Nick attended college on a full scholarship, studying engineering, a passion he had inherited from his father, who had taught him to work with his hands from a young age. College life only further solidified Nick's reputation as someone with integrity, drive, and a magnetic personality that drew people toward him. Everyone saw him as destined for great things, but what made Nick stand out was his genuine care for those around him. While at college, Nick met Sarah Lawson. She was beautiful, with a quiet confidence and an air of mystery that captivated him. Unlike the women Nick had dated before, Sarah was an enigma. She wasn't interested in the attention he received from others. In fact, she seemed to push it aside, challenging Nick in ways no one else had. She was intelligent, independent, and ambitious, working her way through law school while managing her family's small real estate business. Their connection was immediate, and Nick, ever the romantic, quickly fell in love with her. Nick saw Sarah as his equal, someone who would challenge him, inspire him, and build a life alongside him. After 4 years of dating, he proposed to her in the most heartfelt, intimate way he could imagine, and she said yes. To Nick, Sarah was the embodiment of his future. He imagined a life filled with joy, children, success, and above all, love. He never doubted her loyalty, never questioned her feelings for him. To him, Sarah was as trustworthy as the foundation his parents had instilled in him. Nick's proposal to Sarah was met with excitement from both families. His parents, especially his mother, adored Sarah. Amelia had always seen Sarah as the perfect match for her son. A woman who shared the same values and ambitions as Nick. The wedding preparations began quickly, and Sarah, with her sharp organizational skills, took the lead in planning every detail of their big day. As the months passed, the couple appeared to everyone around him as the epitome of love and success. They were the power couple everyone admired, each excelling in their respective careers while preparing for the next chapter of their lives together. Nick's career had taken off as an engineer, where he was quickly climbing the ranks at his company. Sarah was equally successful in her legal career, working for a prestigious law firm. However, as the wedding day approached, something shifted. Nick, a man of intuition, began noticing subtle changes in Sarah's behavior. She became distant, her usual warmth replaced by an air of distraction. She would often make excuses to avoid spending time with him, citing work or wedding planning stress as the reasons for her absence. Nick, trusting Sarah implicitly, chalked it up to the pressure of the upcoming wedding. After all, he reasoned, planning a wedding while juggling two demanding careers was no easy feat. Still, small doubts began to creep into Nick's mind. Late-night phone calls, sudden changes in plans, and unexplained absences were things he couldn't completely ignore. But he convinced himself that he was overthinking. After all, Nick had always been the rational one, the steady rock in every situation. He told himself that Sarah loved him, and that was enough. Yet, a gnawing feeling remained. Something was off, and Nick, for the first time in his life, felt unsure. But rather than confront the situation head-on, Nick buried his doubts deep within. Focusing on the wedding preparations and their future together, he wanted to believe that everything was fine, that the woman he had given his heart to would never betray him. The day of the wedding was perfect by all outward appearances. The sun shone brightly in the cloudless sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the picturesque venue. A sprawling estate nestled in the countryside. The air was filled with the scent of blooming roses, and the atmosphere buzzed with excitement as family and friends gathered to witness the union of Nick and Sarah. Nick stood in front of the mirror in his dressing room, adjusting his tie and taking a deep breath. He was nervous, but it wasn't the usual pre-wedding jitters. There was a heaviness in his chest, a weight he couldn't quite shake. Despite his excitement, despite his love for Sarah, that gnawing feeling of uncertainty persisted. He had never been one to doubt those he loved, but today, standing on the brink of a new life, Nick couldn't ignore the sense that something was terribly wrong. As the ceremony began, Nick stood at the altar, watching as Sarah made her way down the aisle. She looked breathtaking in her white gown, a vision of elegance and grace. But as she approached, Nick noticed a flicker of something in her eyes, something that wasn't joy or excitement. It was as if she was hiding behind a mask, her smile too forced, her gaze too fleeting. Nick felt a cold shiver run down his spine, but he pushed it aside, telling himself that it was just his nerves playing tricks on him. The vows were exchanged, and for a brief moment, Nick allowed himself to believe that everything was going to be okay. The love he had for Sarah was so deep, so consuming, that he wanted to believe pounding in his chest, as if it was ready to burst into pieces. Nick walked without making out the road. His thoughts were heavy as lead. He felt betrayed, empty, as if everything that was dear to him had been taken away from him. Nick found himself on the street, not noticing any passers-by, or cars, or the beautiful garden around the wedding venue. He stopped at a large fountain, his heart pounded in his chest, as though it were ready to burst. Nick walked aimlessly, unable to focus on his surroundings. His thoughts were heavy, dark, dragging him into a pit of despair. He felt betrayed, hollow, as if everything he had ever valued had been ripped from him. Outside, the crisp air hitting his face, but it did nothing to calm the storm raging inside. Nick wandered without direction, paying no attention to the beauty of the manicured garden, the wedding guests murmuring in disbelief, or the cars passing by the estate. He stopped at a large fountain. the gentle burble of the water mocking the chaos in his mind. It was as though the calmness of the fountain stood in stark contrast to the anguish that consumed him. His chest tightened, and he gasped for air, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just transpired. The love of his life, the woman he had trusted with his future, had been living a lie. Sarah's betrayal wasn't just an infidelity. It was the destruction of everything he had believed in, their relationship, their plans, his very understanding of who she was. Nick had always prided himself on his ability to read people, on his keen sense of judgment. But now, standing by the fountain, his reflection wavering in the rippling water, he realized just how blind he had been. He had been so consumed by love, so enamored with the idea of a perfect life with Sarah, that he had ignored the signs. The late-night phone call she had dismissed as work, the unexplained absences, the slight hesitations in her voice when he asked where she had been, all of it suddenly made sense. But understanding the truth didn't make the pain any less real. If anything, it made it worse. How could he have let himself be so vulnerable, so exposed? How could he have believed so completely in someone who had deceived him so thoroughly? His mind raced, flickering between rage, sorrow, and disbelief. Images of their life together flashed before him. The day they met, their first date, the night he proposed to her. Every memory now felt tainted, hollow. He had built his future on a foundation of lies, and now, it had crumbled beneath him. Nick's body shook as the weight of his emotions bore down on him. He could still hear the faint murmur of the wedding guests behind him, a mixture of shock and confusion over the revelation that had destroyed what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. But he couldn't go back in there. He couldn't face them, or Sarah, not after what had just been laid bare for everyone to see. As the reality of his shattered life sank in, a deep, aching despair began to take hold. It felt as if there was no escape from the pain, no way to repair the damage that had been done. The world he had known, the future he had so carefully planned, was gone, and with it, any sense of control or stability. The calm, composed man who had always been the pillar of strength for those around him now felt like he was falling apart. The betrayal had cut too deep, struck at the very core of who he was. Nick had always believed in loyalty, trust, and honor, values passed down to him by his parents, values he had lived by his entire life. And now, in a single moment, those beliefs had been shattered. He looked into the water of the fountain, seeing his reflection blurred and distorted by the movement of the water. The face staring back at him was unrecognizable, filled with anguish, disbelief, and something darker, a sense of hopelessness. Nick had always been a man of action, someone who dealt with problems head-on. But this was different. This wasn't a problem he could fix or a challenge he could overcome. Sarah's betrayal wasn't something that could be mended with time or effort. It had broken something inside him, something that felt irreparable. In that moment, standing by the fountain with the echoes of his shattered wedding behind him, Nick felt a darkness close in. The pain was unbearable, the humiliation overwhelming. He had lost everything, his trust, his future, his sense of self, and in that crushing weight of despair, he made a decision that he would never have made in any other moment, a decision born of agony and hopelessness. Without a word, without a final thought, Nick walked away from the fountain, away from the estate, away from the life that had been torn apart. The path ahead of him was unclear, but the darkness inside him had made one thing certain: there was no going back. News of Nick's tragic death spread like wildfire. His friends and family, who had watched the seemingly perfect man crumble before their eyes, were left in shock and disbelief. The man who had always been the embodiment of strength and integrity had been pushed to his breaking point by a betrayal so deep, so devastating, that it had led him to take his own life. The wedding, which was meant to be a celebration of love and unity, had instead become a scene of mourning and sorrow. Guests whispered in hushed tones, unable to comprehend how things had gone so terribly wrong. The headlines in the days that followed were filled with speculation, but no one could truly understand the depths of Nick's pain. Sarah, now left alone in the wreckage of her choices, was consumed by guilt and grief. She had never imagined that her affair would lead to such devastating consequences. That her actions would destroy not only her relationship with Nick but also his life. The weight of what she had done was unbearable, and she was left to confront the reality that she had played a part in his death. Jason, the man who had revealed the affair, disappeared from the public eye. His role in the tragedy condemned by all who knew him. He had thought he was exposing a truth that needed to be revealed, but instead, he had set off a chain of events that led to unimaginable loss. For those who had known Nick, the loss was immeasurable. His family, devastated by his sudden death, struggled to cope with the senselessness of it all. His friends, who had always seen him as a beacon of hope and strength, were left grappling with the void he had left behind. Nick Hargrove, a man who had once been full of life, promise, and love, was now gone. His story, one that had been filled with hope and ambition, had ended in tragedy, leaving behind a legacy of heartbreak and loss. The wedding, the day that was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter, had instead become the final page in a story cut tragically short. And in the silence that followed, the only thing that remained was the memory of a man who had given everything to love, only to have it torn away in the cruelest of ways. Nick Hargrove's death left a profound and permanent scar on everyone who had known him. The community that had once admired him as a beacon of stability and success now mourned the loss of a man who had been, to all appearances, unshakable. His friends, family, and colleagues were left with endless questions, guilt, and grief that seemed impossible to reconcile. How could someone like Nick, who embodied strength and integrity, have reached such a breaking point? How could they have missed the signs of his internal struggle? Nick's parents, Paul and Amelia Hargrove, were perhaps the hardest hit. The devastation was unimaginable. Amelia, a strong-willed woman who had always been the bedrock of her family, crumbled under the weight of losing her eldest son. She couldn't understand how the boy she had raised, who had been so full of life and purpose, had felt so lost in his final moments. Her mind ran in endless circles, searching for answers that would never come. Had she not taught him well enough? Had she failed as a mother? These thoughts consumed her in the weeks following Nick's death, and she found herself retreating from the world, unable to bear the pain. Paul, a man of few words, retreated into silence. The military had taught him to handle adversity with stoicism. But this was a blow unlike any he had ever endured. He had survived war, loss, and hardship, but the loss of his son, and in such a senseless manner, left him broken in a way no battlefield ever could. Paul had always prided himself on being a man of honor, a man who instilled those same values in his children. Nick had embodied those values, and yet, he had been betrayed by the very person he loved the most. Paul was left questioning the world he thought he knew, haunted by the notion that honor and loyalty had become empty words. Nick's younger brother, David struggled to process his grief as well. He had always looked up to Nick, idolized him even. Nick had been his protector, his guide, and his role model. But now, David was left adrift, unable to comprehend how someone so seemingly invincible had been brought so low. The news of the affair and its devastating consequences hit him like a tidal wave. David couldn't help but feel a deep anger towards Sarah, the woman who had destroyed his brother's life, but that anger was complicated by his own feelings of helplessness. He had seen the signs, too, the tension in Nick's face, the unspoken doubts, but like everyone else, he had dismissed them. He had trusted Nick's judgment, trusted his ability to handle things, and now, that trust felt like a betrayal of his own. The Hargrove family became a shell of its former self. Their once warm and inviting home, a place where laughter and conversation had flourished, now felt cold and empty. Amelia's once bright spirit had dimmed, and Paul, always a man of action, seemed lost in his own thoughts, unable to find a way forward. They had raised their sons to be strong, to face challenges head-on, and yet, they had been powerless to stop this. For Sarah Lawson, the aftermath of Nick's death was a living nightmare. She had never anticipated the full weight of her actions or the irreversible damage they would cause. The affair with Jason Warren, which had once seemed like a thrilling escape from the pressures of her life, now felt like a grotesque mistake, one that had led to the ultimate tragedy. What had once been a secret, an indulgence, had spiraled into something far darker than she could have ever imagined. In the days and weeks following Nick's death, Sarah was consumed by guilt. She could hardly bear to look at herself in the mirror, knowing that her actions had contributed to the destruction of the man who had loved her more than anyone else. The public shame was unbearable. Everywhere she went, she was met with whispers, judgmental glances, and outright condemnation. She had become the villain in the story, the woman who had betrayed her loyal fiancé and driven him to his death. Sarah's career as a lawyer, once promising and full of potential, was effectively over. Clients distanced themselves from her, not wanting to be associated with someone whose personal scandal had been plastered across newspapers and social media. Her colleagues, who had once respected her sharp legal mind, now avoided her entirely. She was alone, isolated in her own misery, with only her guilt as a companion. Jason Warren, the man she had been involved with, had disappeared from her life as quickly as he had entered it. After the wedding disaster, he left town, unwilling to face the repercussions of his own actions. Sarah was left to pick up the pieces alone, and the reality of her situation hit her harder with each passing day. She had not only lost Nick, she had lost herself. The version of herself that she had once known, the confident, ambitious woman who had envisioned a bright future, was gone. In her place was a shell of a person, hollowed out by shame and grief. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Nick's face, remembered his love for her, and felt the crushing weight of her betrayal. Sarah couldn't bear the thought of facing Nick's family, the Hargroves, who had welcomed her with open arms, treated her like a daughter, and now likely saw her as the source of their unrelenting grief. She knew she could never make amends, never undo the damage she had caused. The guilt gnawed at her relentlessly, consuming her thoughts and driving her deeper into a state of despair. Her nights were filled with sleeplessness, her days with silence. She had become a ghost of her former self, drifting through life without direction. The world around her, once full of opportunity and excitement, now felt like a prison. a constant reminder of the irreversible choices she had made. The small town where Nick had grown up was rocked by the tragedy. Everyone knew the Hargroves, and Nick's death sent shockwaves through the community. The news of Sarah's affair and the devastating outcome spread like wildfire, becoming the subject of endless gossip and speculation. To many, it was unfathomable that such a well-respected, beloved figure like Nick could have been brought so low by a scandal so sordid. The town's collective grief was palpable. People mourned not just for Nick, but for the idealized version of him they had always known. He had been a role model, a source of pride, and his death was a blow to the very identity of the community. Vigils were held in his honor, and his funeral was attended by hundreds. People who had known him only in passing showed up to pay their respects, to say goodbye to a man who had represented everything good about their town. But underneath the public mourning, there was anger. Many in the town blamed Sarah, seeing her as the catalyst for the tragedy. In their eyes, she had betrayed a good man, and her actions had led to his death. The affair became the subject of endless rumors, with people adding their own details and speculations, painting Sarah as a heartless villain who had destroyed a life for her own selfish desires. Sarah became a pariah. She couldn't walk down the street without feeling the weight of people's stares. The whispers followed her everywhere, and she quickly realized that staying in town was impossible. She had no choice but to leave, to disappear from the life she had once known. But no matter where she went, the guilt followed her. It was inescapable. As the months passed, the town slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the memory of Nick Hargrove's death lingered like a shadow over everything. The Hargrove family, though forever changed, tried to piece their lives back together. Paul returned to work, throwing himself into his business as a way to distract from the overwhelming pain. Amelia, on the other hand, found solace in her garden, spending hours tending to the flowers that Nick had once admired. It was her way of feeling close to him, of holding onto a part of him that would never fade. David, Nick's younger brother, struggled the most with moving on. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow failed his brother, that he should have seen the signs, should have done something to stop the downward spiral. He carried that guilt with him, a heavy burden that weighed on his every step. He often visited Nick's grave, seeking solace in the quiet, though the peace he sought always felt just out of reach. As for Sarah, she left town and never returned. Her life became a series of empty days, each one blending into the next, as she tried to outrun the consequences of her actions. But no matter how far she went, the past clung to her, a constant reminder of what she had done and the life she had destroyed. Nick Hargrove's life had ended in a tragedy no one could have predicted, a tragic consequence of love, betrayal, and broken trust. His death became a cautionary tale in the town, a reminder that even the strongest people can fall when trust is shattered, and that the consequences of betrayal can be more devastating than anyone could ever anticipate. The man who had once been a pillar of strength and integrity was gone, but the memory of him, the man he had been and the tragedy of his downfall, remained, casting a long shadow over everyone he had left behind.